Okay, so our third speaker today is Andrekos Varnava, a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and Professor in British Imperial and Colonial Histories at Flinders University, South Australia, and an Honorary Professor in History at De Montfort University in Leicester. He has authored 4 monographs, edited or co-edited 16 collections, and published over 60 articles or chapters in a wide range of different publications. His paper today is titled Post-British or Post-Ottoman? Mass Violence in Cyprus, 1963 to 1974.
Thank you, Sasha. Can you hear me okay? Right,
Yep.
I'm going to try and share my screen so I can present using the PowerPoint. How's that?
Great. Perfect.
That's a miracle. Okay, so let me start by looking at the abstract here. Let me just minimize this. Good. From December 1963 to August 1974, Cyprus was gripped by an on and off again political violence, I would say civil war, involving Greek Cypriot, Turkish Cypriot, Greek and Turkish forces, which led to many casualties and the forced geographical separation or partition of the population owing to ethnic cleansing. The mass violence is usually classified as an example of post-British or post-imperial violence and partition, with the replacement of the British by the Americans from 1964. Thus, it has also been seen through the prism of the Cold War. This paper builds on this research by adding an additional dimension by viewing these events as also being an example of late post-Ottoman mass violence. It starts by focusing on the British colonial period to establish the post-Ottoman characteristics that evolved before showing how many of these lingered and were at the heart of the mass violence from 63 to 74. I'm going to start with some background and then move into the structure that you can see there, defining the violence from 63 to 74 as colonial or post-colonial, British or post-British, and then moving into post-Ottoman Cyprus pre the violence, pre-55, post-Ottoman violence during the colonial times in 55 to 59, and then the period after from 63 to 74. But I need to sort of establish that earlier period to show you the continuities. So the background very quickly, the Ottoman period, the Ottoman occupation begins in 1570, it runs until 1878, occupied from the Venetians. The Catholic population is either killed or flees or converts to Islam. Muslims are settled, and the Orthodox Church is elevated to prominence as the only Christian authority in the island, and really it's co-opted into the governing system. And I'll come back to that later on. During the British period, 1878 to 1960, to clarify, Cyprus comes under British occupation and administration in 1878, but remains under Ottoman sovereignty until 1914, when the Ottomans enter the war on the side of the Central Powers, and it's at that point that the British annex it. It's not until 1924 that the new Turkey recognizes British sovereignty and abandons any claims to Cyprus in the Treaty of Lausanne, and then following year, Cyprus becomes a crown colony. Fast forwarding, from 1955 to 59, there's a period of violence, sometimes referred to as the Cyprus Emergency or the Anti-Colonial War, or even the Greek Cypriot War of Independence. Of course, it wasn't about independence because the group, EOKA, which was a far right-wing nationalist group, aimed for enosis, that is, the union of Cyprus with Greece, and not independence. The Turkish Defense Force, known as TMT, aimed for partition. Independence was a compromise, and what was created was a consociational republic, which was guaranteed by Britain, Greece, and Turkey. I'll come back to that again later as well. And the Republican period from 1960 until today, well, in 1960, Cyprus became an independent republic. The constitution collapsed in December of 63. We have the start of a civil war. The island is de facto partitioned. And then in 1974, de facto partitioned into 2 sides after a Greek coup and the Turkish invasion. The map I'm showing you now shows you the distribution of the ethnic groups, primarily the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriot. The Maronites are just in that green area there. What I wanted to show you is that the Greek and Turkish Cypriot populations are interspersed throughout the island. There is no one area or even two areas or whatever in which they primarily populate. And the partition that occurred in 1974 basically created these two sides, in which there's a substantial movement of populations in order to create these two, one Turkish Cypriot side and one Greek Cypriot side. Okay, defining the violence between 63 and 74. Well, there are 3 rounds of violence, December of 63 to about August of 1964. There's a brief period of violence in 1967, and then there is 1974. The violence is characterized by small-scale massacres, hostage-taking, random and indiscriminate attacks causing death and injury, and ethnic cleansing or geographical separation. The period when violence subsides, namely between 64 and 67, and then between 67 and 74, is characterized by the Turkish Cypriots living in a state of siege, lacking supplies, reliant on aid, mainly from Turkey. And then in the violence from 63 to 64, this was triggered when Archbishop Makarios proposed 13 amendments to the constitution that diluted the Turkish Cypriot protections and rights within the consociational system. Now, most research backs the positions of one side or the other to varying degrees, and these positions are, well, the Greek Cypriots claim that the Turkish Cypriots revolted in December of 63 to bring about a geographical separation of the two communities to facilitate partition. The Turkish Cypriots argue that the Greek Cypriots attempted to implement the so-called Akritas plan to bring about enosis by repressing Turkish Cypriots through violence and even a genocide. The truth is something a little bit like this. Well, the Greek Cypriots initiated the clashes to implement the Akritas plan, basically to force the Turkish Cypriots to the table, to accept those 13 amendments. While the Turkish Cypriots were prepared for clashes to start in 1964 and did plan to, a form of geographical separation in the hope of Turkey intervening. Now, recent research that I've done with Tim Mansueto argues that the period from 63 to 67 has the features of a civil war and suggests that 1974 also does. And we propose that the entire period should be considered as one civil war period with different rounds of hot violence and cold violence. The period of 1974 is somewhat complicated by the fact that there is a coup by the Greek military junta in Athens, in Cyprus, toppling the regime of Makarios, which triggers the invasion. But we also must see the involvement of Greece and Turkey in terms of the fact, well, the Greek Cypriots wanted to unite with Greece, identify with Greece, and the Turkish Cypriots wanted partition, and therefore also known as double enosis, by the way, with Turkey, so they identify with Turkey. So it's perhaps not as complicated as one might think. But also there are other things happening in 1974, which I would say are characteristics of a more traditional civil war as well. Let me introduce you to this slide with Anita Dimitriou, who's the president of the House of Representatives in the Republic of Cyprus, but also the leader of the center-right wing VC party since this year, in which she is basically referring to the 14th of August 1974, which is the second phase of the Operation Attilas, the Turkish invasion, coming to, as she says, Famagusta and Morphu. We must continue to work for the freedom and reunification of our homeland, respecting the refugees, the mothers of the missing, and our heroes. And I draw your attention to the photo because that photo has nothing to do with 1974 and is in fact a photo by Don McCullen at Gaziveran in Cyprus of Nevcihan Olusum, which was published in The Observer on the 20th of March 1964 and was the World Press Photo of the Year in that year. So you can see here the propaganda, the use and misuse of photos, a photo from 1964, being used to argue a position in 1974, and also, clearly cannot distinguish between Greek and Turkish Cypriots. Next, I have a table here showing the displaced persons from 1963-64. You can see here that the majority are Turkish Cypriots, around 25,000, which is around 24% of the Turkish Cypriot population. There's also a substantial proportion of Armenian Cypriots who were displaced during that round of violence. The table on expulsions indicates from 74 this time indicates again substantial numbers, in this case 155,000 Greek Cypriots, 60,000 Turkish Cypriots, 4,000 Maronite Cypriots, and 1,000 Armenian Cypriots. You can see there that around a third of the Greek Cypriots were displaced, and half of the Turkish Cypriots were displaced. The deaths and missing from 1974, you can see here that this is an ongoing thing. So when you read there, there's those that were classified as dead more or less from the time, and then there is those who I've said there are missing in inverted commas, but that have since been determined to be dead. Their remains have been located, and then those who are still missing, these figures are changing all the time because of the work of the Committee on Missing Persons. So you can see here that in overall there's just over 4,000 who were killed during that round of violence in 1974. And here is a table of massacres in 1974. I omitted to include one for 63-64, although there was some small-scale massacres. The largest one in 74 was Aloha Maratha, and I should have had there Sandalar and Famagusta, of around 126 women, children, and elderly Turkish Cypriots by Greek Cypriot militia, namely Eoka B, which had been formed and had been used by the Greek junta to overthrow the government of Makarios. This is a photo from the time when one of the mass graves was discovered, and the Turkish Cypriot prays where they found 86 Turkish Cypriot bodies. And you can see that there are photojournalists on the scene as well, and the UN. This is a UN photo. Okay, so let's go back to look at the period between 1955 and 59, the violence as colonial or British. Well, the violence predates the post-colonial Republican period. From the 1880s, basically the British encouraged Orthodox Cypriots to call themselves Romni or Romans, to believe that they were Greeks, and for the Muslim Cypriots to believe that they were Turks. That this was done through various means, the education system and so forth. In 1912, we have minor Christian-Muslim clashes in Cyprus over the Balkan Wars. In 1929, we have the formation of the far-right secret armed organization known as EREK to bring about immediate enosis as something that's anti-British, extreme nationalist, far-right, even fascist group. In 1931, there are disturbances against the economic downturn, mixed with Greek nationalist riots leading to the burning of Government House in Nicosia and attacks on other government buildings and infrastructure. The British suspended constitution and implemented crackdown. 1934, the remnants of EREK, because most of them have been sent abroad, exiled, they seemingly assassinate Antonios Triantafylidis, a leading politician, for wanting to rebuild relations with the British to lay the foundations for enosis in the future. In 1950, by now, both the far right and far left view enosis as national liberation from the British. Self-government under the British and independence are now both rejected by both the left and the right. Then in 1951, EOKA was formed in Athens from former EREK members, now also Archbishop Makarios III, and the right-wing Greek army personnel. They recruit Colonel Grievous, who is the leader of the HI organization during the German occupation of Greece and the Greek Civil War, an extreme far right-wing group, to run the armed campaign for enosis. Grievous was a Cypriot, but hadn't lived in Cyprus for most of his life. In 1955, we have the armed campaign started against the British. The British respond in a similar way as in Kenya, with policing, military high military presence, concentration camps, practicing torture. There were hangings, curfews, and so forth. The British deployed divide and rule by encouraging Turkish Cypriots in Turkey against Greek Cypriots in Greece to combat eoka and the demand for enosis. The British do not propose independence as a solution, but a series of plans that try to retain Cyprus under British sovereignty. Turkish Cypriots initially demanded a continuation of British rule, which is quite unusual, but then they fall behind supporting partition. Both ideas are clearly rooted in British imperialism. This is the cover of my book on the assassination that I mentioned earlier and the origins of eoka. The 1963-74 violence is pro-British. Well, here we have Greek and Turkish Cypriots and those that support their official propaganda narratives blaming the British and the Americans for the violence and the de facto partition. The British are blamed for creating the conditions by practicing divide and rule from the day they stepped foot in Cyprus. As for the conflict in 63, 64, and 67, the British are blamed for the outbreaks and the continued violence. The Turkish Cypriots blame the High Commissioner, the British High Commissioner, for encouraging the Greek Cypriot amendments, which were proposed on the 30th of November of 63. The Greek Cypriots blame the British for trying to keep both sides apart, for drawing the Green Line in Nicosia. Both sides blame the British for failing to sort things out at London Conference in January of 64. After this, the US replaces the British as the main Western power trying to resolve the crisis, but always they're sort of now referred to as the Anglo-Americans, are blamed conjointly for the crisis in 67, and the same as well in 1974 for not stopping the Turkish invasion. Often the partition of Cyprus is considered by many as inevitable since the British seem to leave other places partitioned, British India, Palestine, and so forth. Here is an example of some of this. In March of 1964, thousands of Greeks marched through the streets of Athens to the American and British embassies to denounce the attitude of the two nations on Cyprus. Here's shown placing the Ottoman fez hats on the British embassy, as if to say the British are Turks. English get out of Cyprus, an anti-British slogan by Greek Cypriots demonstrating in front of Parliament House in Athens in 1974, as if to say that, you know, the coup that had occurred and other problems that didn't, weren't part of the problem, that the real problem is the British, so get out of Cyprus. That also probably refers to the fact that the British have bases in Cyprus. Here is an anti-NATO demonstration in Sydney in 1974. So again, sort of the blame is being attributed to the Anglo-Americans. Okay, so now to show the Ottoman dimension here. So post-Ottoman Cyprus, 1878 to 1960. Ottoman sovereignty is still there until 1914, even though the Ottoman Empire doesn't relinquish its sovereignty until 1924. The British rule did make many changes, but also kept many Ottoman policies and practices. For instance, laws, many Ottoman laws still existed well into the 1920s. Just the other day, completely different project discovered that the Ottoman tobacco law was only replaced in 1927. Another example, the Cyprus tribute that the UK promised to the Ottoman Empire back in 1878, but which it retained because of the defaulted Ottoman Crimean War loan, continued to be taken until 1928, well after the Ottoman Empire had ended. Class, another example, late Ottoman Cyprus consisted basically of 80% peasants, 10 to 15% rural laborers, and 3 to 5% middle class, maybe 1 or 2% elite. Little changed in the first 45 years of British rule. By the mid-1920s, peasant numbers may have decreased, laborers may have increased. We have new types of laborers in industries such as mines and manufacturing under the British. And the educated elite also grow, yet there is an estimation in a report in 1930 that 80% of the population was on the poverty line or below it. So not a great deal is changing. In terms of identity, officially, the Orthodox Christians were referred to as non-Mohammedans by the British, although privately they referred to them as Greeks, and the Muslims were Mohammedans. Orthodox Christians still called themselves Romans or Romni, changing to Greeks by the elites and the education system, though many still called themselves Romye into the 1970s, while the process for the Muslims changing to Turks was even slower. Orthodox Christians essentially become Greeks, Muslims become Turks based on, now this is all based on the Ottoman system of religious identities, and it's a very slow process for this to transition into more national identities based on ethnicity, although I would say ethno-religious identities. Independence, British, Greek, and Turkish guarantee of the new republic. This is also something that I think goes back to the 1820s and 30s with the guarantee of the Greek state. There's a similar sort of guarantee here, although in that case it was between Britain, France, and Russia. The other thing I want to talk about is the idea of ethnarch, the ethnarch leadership that developed under the Ottomans and transformed from 1900 as the Archbishop of Cyprus adopted ethno-religious nationalism and enosis as a counter to the British rule and the Turkish demographic minority. Now, Makarios III took this to the next level with his international approach to the situation. And I'll pick that up in a moment when we look at the post-1960 period and how that continues. Independence, consociational system of government that was adopted in 1960 was rooted in the Ottoman millet system as it recognized two politically equal communities based on their ethno-religious identities, the Greeks and the Turks. Even the other demographic minorities, the Maronites, the Armenians, they had to decide whether they belonged to the Greek community or to the Turkish community. British, Greek, and Turkish guarantee of a constitution, as I said, was similar to the guaranteeing of the Greek state. More about the development of the Archbishop ethnarch role can be found in this edited volume that I did about 10 years ago now, I reckon. Now, the violence between 55 and 59 as post-Ottoman, well, we have to understand that EOKA was rooted in Erek, which formed in 1929 as this anti-Britishness expressed through a combination of fascism and extreme nationalism, but rooted in 19th century Greek irredentism, the idea of the great idea, and also the clandestine nature of the organization and proposed use of arms mimicked the Filikiyeteria or the Friendly Society of the 1820s, which led the Greek War of Independence. EOKA was modeled on Erek, therefore on the Greek Friendly Society as well. EOKA has wider support than Erek. It has support from forces in Greece. Enosis and its broader ideology and violence camouflaged its anti-colonial, was camouflaged as anti-colonial, I should say, but in reality was rooted in 19th century Greek irredentism and the great idea. It's only anti-colonial insofar as the British stand in the way of enosis. Its own propaganda linked EOKA constantly to the Filikiyeteria and to the Greek War of Independence, including in its first revolutionary leaflet, the use of the terms enosis as a struggle, just like in the Greek War of Independence. EOKA's motto was death or victory. The motto for the Filikiyeteria was victory or death. The Filikiyeteria was a product of the Ottoman Empire, while EOKA seems to have been a product of both the Ottoman and British empires in Cyprus. The Turkish Cypriots are the most obvious visible connection to the Ottoman Empire, being Muslims and considering themselves Turks. Always opposed enosis, initially wanting the continuation of British rule, then arguing that Cyprus had previously belonged to the Ottoman Empire and so should be returned to Turkey or partitioned. Its armed resistance through TMT to EOKA followed the Ottoman pattern of secret unit in the Ottoman army because of the role of the Turkish army here, though now we have also the Cold War context, but that also applies to EOKA as well. Here is an EOKA propaganda flag, co-opting the flag of the Greek War of Independence. Here we have this guy, Yannis Peyotis, who is celebrating this, by the way, celebrating the links between EOKA and the Greek War of Independence in an article only just published about a year ago. Now, the 1963-74 violence is post-Ottoman. Well, there are numerous continuities. First of all, the armed groups that we discussed, EOKA and TMT, they continue. We have the identities that we've discussed before, the ethno-religious identities, they continue. And also the ethnarchism, that continues. In fact, it goes to the next level, as we will see. The armed groups, well, TMT continues largely unchanged. Meanwhile, EOKA does splinter into an officially supported Akritas organization under the Minister of Interior, Polikarpos Yorkagis, and other smaller groups that Makarios, I'll say beyond, more than just tolerates them, he allows them to exist. Identities, well, the constitution recognizes just two communities, Greeks and Turks, based on ethno-religious criteria. It follows the Ottoman millet system and the British system. The constitution further enshrines ethno-religious identities through the communal chambers, which allowed the communities to propagate Greek and Turkish national identities and histories, as opposed to, Cypriot ones, and indeed these hatreds as well. Ethnarchism. Well, Makarios consolidates the role of the ethnarch by becoming president. Would have been great that I can, put up an image of Makarios, and probably, as far as I know, the only other religious head to become head of state and head of government that I can think of anyway, and perhaps you can correct me, in the world, and that is the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. So this goes back to the Ottoman Empire, where religion was at the forefront of the administration. It blends, or he did, it blended ethnarchism with EOKA to create what I've called in other publications an eokatokratia. In other words, the country is held by EOKA, which is a play on the Greek Cypriots and Greeks talking about Turkokratia, or held by the Turks during Ottoman rule. Makarios did not accept independence as a permanent solution in 1958 when he first accepted it, when he first proposed it. He authorized the formation of the Akritas organization. He proposed the 13 constitutional changes, and he authorized the start of the clashes on the eve of Christmas 63, all trying to achieve enosis. Here he is here, the Archbishop, viewing armored vehicles of the Cypriot security forces on EOKA Day in 1964. And here too, Orthodox priests in Athens waving an EOKA flag. And that's another reason why I've included the photo. You can see Cyprus in the middle there of an old traditional sort of Greek flag. Now, the 1963-74 violence is post-Ottoman. Well, geographical separation and ethnic cleansing. Well, if partition is a post-Ottoman, is a post-British phenomenon, then ethnic cleansing is certainly post-British and post-Ottoman. The Cypriot case has specific post-Ottoman features. The clash between Greek irredentism and imperialism to create a greater Greece, and Turkish nationalist desires to protect Turkish Muslim communities through geographical separation and expulsions was a feature of the Turkish War of Independence. There is even an agreed exchange of populations in Cyprus in 1974 along sort of similar lines to the one agreed to in 1920s. Like the Turkish War of Independence, the conflict in Cyprus also becomes one over territory and who should control it. Greece through enosis, Turkey through partition, the Greek Cypriots through the Republic of Cyprus, which is the only internationally recognized government in Cyprus since 1964, or the Turkish Cypriots through the TRNC, which remains internationally unrecognized. So, conscious, I've sort of probably gone over time. In conclusion, the Cypriot Civil War between 63 and 74 must be understood as arising from both post-British and post-Ottoman imperial legacies. The post-Ottoman imperial legacies include the ethno-religious identity formation. I want to emphasize that I see this more in terms of the Greek Cypriots rather than as much with the Turkish Cypriots, who I think have a secular, stronger secularization. The great idea, the ideology of a greater Greece, lingers during the Republican period after it had well and truly ended in Greece, which clashes with Turkish nationalism and the protection of the Turkish Cypriot minority, demographic minority. Okay, and the Greek War of Independence. Well, this lingers into the Republican period. It's still strong today. The Cypriot national anthem is the same national anthem of Greece, which is the Hymn to Liberty, which was written by Dionysios Solomos for the Greek War of Independence. Ethnarchism, the new state, especially from 64, sees religion and state combined in Makarios, who enshrines Greek nationalism and the worship of the Greek heroes of 1821 with the Eoka heroes, and appoints Eoka cadres as ministers and advisors. As I've said before, this is what I've termed Eokatokratia. The geographical separation is as a consequence of the armed conflict and violence, again, has particularly echoes of the post-Ottoman period. The ethnic cleansing and partition, also here, I would say, a feature of both post-British and post-Ottoman empires. So I think that, although this is rather an exploratory sort of paper, I think I've hopefully made the case that there are post-Ottoman legacies connected to the violence or civil war between 63 and 74. Thanks.